Hey guys, welcome to Squadron TV. I've got a real interesting video I want to share with you today. As we build these models and we think about what we're going to build next, you start researching the subject that you're interested in. And let's take this B-17 for example. There's so much history to learn about B-17s, and it's like every time I start looking into it, I learn something new. But how often do we get the opportunity to talk to somebody this day and age, because of how long it's been, but to talk to somebody who actually flew these aircraft? Well, today I'm lucky enough to be able to interview John Luckadoo, who flew with the 100th Bomb Group over Europe in 1943. And he's here, he's with us today at 102 years old to tell a little bit of his story. So let's welcome Lucky and check it out. Well, I have got Lucky Luckadoo with us here today. And how are you today, Lucky?
I'm very well for an old guy, Brandon. Thank you.
There you go. Now, you say you're an old guy. Exactly how old are you?
I had my 102nd birthday 2 months ago,
That's awesome.
16th of March.
Awesome. Well, good. I look forward to hearing about your 103rd birthday next March.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you.
Well, that's awesome. Well, 102 years ago, where were you born?
In Chattanooga, Tennessee.
All right. Well, I know
Um,
that area
uh,
very well.
you do? All right.
Yep.
Chattanooga has Lookout Mountain, Signal Mountain, and Missionary Ridge
Mm-hmm.
surrounding the big loop in the Tennessee River where Chattanooga is located. And I grew up on Missionary Ridge, which is actually the site of a very famous Civil War event in
Okay.
1864, the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where Ulysses S. Grant um, routed the Confederates and ran them off the ridge. And that's a sort of a mysterious uh, situation because General Bragg, who was the commander of the Confederate forces, actually had the high ground and he had the advantage, but unfortunately established his line of defense on the crest of the ridge, and it should have been just over the crest, pointing downward, because Grant pulled in 80,000 troops and just simply surged up the side of the ridge, and he never knew what hit him.
I got you, and but that's where you were born, right
That's
there.
where I was born and grew up
Okay, that's awesome. Now, how long did you live there?
until Pearl Harbor.
Okay,
At that point, I was in my sophomore year in the University of Chattanooga, which is now part of the University of Tennessee out of Knoxville. And when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, um, my fraternity brothers and I marched down and we joined up en masse almost because in those days it was known as the United States Army Air Corps, not the Air Force. It was not an Air Force until 1947 after World War II. So if you volunteered, then you could select the branch of service in which you served. And I elected to learn to fly and applied for the aviation cadet program, which I was accepted and was sent then immediately to, or shortly thereafter, to Montgomery Field or Maxwell Field in Montgomery, Alabama for pre-flight.
okay. Now, up to this point, had you really done much traveling, or was I know that your entire world was about to change over the next few years, but up to this point, had you really gone anywhere?
Not really. I
Okay.
had not been terribly far from home. It was our custom as a family to vacation in the summer at Wrightsville Beach in North Carolina,
Okay.
uh, and or South Carolina, and so we traveled mostly by train in those days, and we would spend a month at the seashore um, before the crash. Uh, the stock market crashed in 1929, and it had a profound effect on my family in particular because my dad was a stockbroker,
Ah,
and all of our assets were essentially in stock. And so overnight, um, the picture changed drastically when I was about 7 years old.
wow. Okay. Well, talking about not going very far, but you got to vacation. I guess even when you went for your training, just being in Alabama, that was not too terribly far from home.
No, it wasn't. And in fact, I was assigned to what was known as the Southeast Training Command and proceeded from um, Alabama to Florida, where uh, I took in, I went through my primary training
Right.
there, and that's where I really soloed and learned how to fly. From there, I proceeded to South Carolina in Sumter, Shaw Field for basic,
Hmm.
and ended up back in Georgia at Moody Field in Valdosta, Georgia, where I graduated from multi-engine flying school in early 1943.
Okay. Yeah, I know where Valdosta is. I myself, I'm from Americus, Georgia,
Okay.
a couple of hours from there. So,
Hmm.
all right. So, 1943, you're ready to go. You're ready to fly. So, how did you? When was your first trip? Where did you go? How did you get started in the war?
Brandon, as I had hoped, the docu-series that has just been released this year called Masters of the Air would
Mm-hmm.
reflect and document something happened to my particular class in advanced flying school that did not happen to any other group.
Okay.
And that was they took 40 of us directly from graduation and sent us immediately to Kearney, Nebraska, where there was a B-17 outfit called the Hundredth Bomb Group that had been all the way through their pre-combat training as a unit and as a team, and suddenly pulled out all of the co-pilots of every crew. There were 50 crews, and put 40 of us. And they also brought in some 10 other pilots, newly graduated pilots who were flight officers. They were not commissioned. But they put us in the right hand seat, and we'd never been in a B 17 before. And the unit was just ready to ship out for overseas. And here they suddenly changed the number two in command of each crew, 10-man crews, to somebody that had never been in the airplane, was totally unfamiliar with the organization as well as the individuals, and certainly with the equipment that we were going to war with. Now, they didn't do that in any other group, and there's never been any documentation of that. No historian has ever recorded it. And that was one of the reasons why I insisted on writing my book and recording some of the things that did occur to the what became known as the Bloody Hundredth Bomb Group,
Right.
that didn't happen to any other group.
Hmm. Yes, and I just received a copy of your book. You were at the Warbird weekend a week or two ago, and a friend of mine named Ed bought a copy of your book for me and got you to sign it. So I appreciate that. I look forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet. I just got it in the mail from him. So I do look forward to reading that and hearing about your entire story. And that is interesting to know that that was never documented, never happened to other groups. So I guess that's a very unique thing for you and your group that that was done, to y'all, but nobody else.
Well, it was only one of several things that happened, which I
Right.
had pointed out during the course of the production of the docuseries to the screenwriters, but they still chose not to even mention it in the series itself. And when I was in attendance at the premiere on January the 26th in Hollywood, um, I had Tom Hanks on one side and Steven Spielberg on the other side, and I turned to both of them and I said, they wanted to know what they'd gotten wrong. And I said, well, I would, number one, I'm going to reserve any opinion until I've seen all 9 episodes.
Hmm.
And number two, I'm particularly interested in seeing how you dealt with, or if you did, the specific things that I mentioned to you from the beginning, which was 10 years prior, back in 2013, that happened to the 100th that did not happen to any other group. And they said, they looked at each other and with kind of blank expressions and didn't say anything. And I said, we'll get together after you've screened all of the episodes.
Well, that's too bad that they left that out. I'm sure just in 9 episodes, there's no telling how much they left out. You would know, but just in 9 episodes, I can't imagine how much more uh, that could have been told.
Well, exactly. And actually, as far as the series is concerned, I'll have to say that they did a very good job of reflecting personalities of those of us who were serving at that time
Okay.
in the Army Air Corps and the 8th Air Force. Um, but it did not really reflect what the group as a unit accomplished during the 2 years that they were confronted by the Luftwaffe. And that was a very scary experience, to say the least. As far as the book is concerned, I collaborated with a very excellent writer who I think did an outstanding job of reflecting the story of my life. And I, I will mention to you briefly that I had never met him and did not meet him until the book was over.
Okay.
And the reason was that just as we agreed to collaborate, COVID hit. And so we could not get together for him to interview me personally, which he intended to do because he lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I was in Dallas, Texas. So it was his intention to come and interview me periodically and then go back home and write several chapters and then submit them to me for editing because I reserved the right, of course, to approve the what he said because he had never written anything about the air wars before. His previous experience as a writer had been to publish 10 books about the ground forces. And so I was a little skeptical as to whether or not he could adapt to our vernacular and the things that happened to us and express them in uh, as accurate form as possible. But he did his homework. He interviewed me almost daily over the phone for an hour or two for 18 months.
Wow.
And we still had never met face to face until after the book was published.
Okay. And just in case listeners are curious, here's the book that we're talking about called Damn Lucky. And this is the story of Lucky's life, of pertaining to the being in the Hundredth Bomb Group. So this is, like I said, I've got my copy. Very excited and looking forward to reading it, and just can't wait to see what all's in there.
Well, I certainly feel that you will agree that he did an excellent job of reflecting um, as best you can in narrative form most of what we experienced.
Right.
As I told him, and as I also told the producers of the docuseries, that there were two things that could not be conveyed either in book form or in film that we experienced. And the first was the bitter and unbelievable cold that
Mm,
we had to endure at high altitudes in those unpressurized airplanes at 25 to 29,000 feet, 50 to 60 degrees below zero for hours on end, and how it so seriously impacted our ability to perform our functions and fly formation and bomb with any degree of accuracy under those conditions, in addition to being shot at, which was something else that they couldn't really adequately convey, is what sheer terror and how scary it was to be shot at, uh, and realizing that as a young guy, 20 years old, your opponent was out to kill you, and it was either kill or be killed, and that was the end of it. So if you survive those circumstances, as well as the others of anti-aircraft fire and uh, mechanical difficulties with your equipment and all of the other things that we had to deal with, uh, you were just extremely lucky. And that's why I named the book Damn Lucky, because it is just a matter of a guardian angel being on your shoulder or you don't survive. It isn't a matter of how well you perform or you don't perform. It's just a matter of sheer absolute luck if you're spared,
wow.
which fortunately I was. And as I mentioned earlier, the 40 of us from my class that went to the 100th Bomb Group, only 4 completed a combat tour of 25 missions.
Wow.
That's a 10% ratio of survival. And if a crew as a unit survived 7 or 8 missions, they were on borrowed time. And so that's the kind of overwhelming opposition that we were thrown up against as citizen soldiers. We were going up against professionals. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been battling for 4 years. They were battle tested. They had excellent equipment. They had developed their techniques of attack, of formations superbly, and they knew full well what they were doing, and we did not have a clue what we were doing. We were just thrown in as guinea pigs to try and prove a strategy of how the bomber force of the 8th Air Force would be best utilized against the enemy, since the Third Reich had occupied all of continental Europe at that point and was threatening, of course, to cross the North Sea and invade England. And if they did, then it was just a next step for them to attack the east coast of America. So it was a precarious time, precarious circumstances, and your chance of survival were extremely slim, if not negative.
Well, I think that you accurately named your book.
I think so. It wasn't intended to be profane, but it was just a frank admission that um, survival was a matter of beyond the control of each of us. And we just had to take our chances and suck it up and do the best that we could under those circumstances. And if we survived, fine. If we didn't, we were either prisoners of war or 6 feet under.
Right. Okay. Well, talking about, and in the book, we'll be able to hear everything. But we watch the Masters of the Air, and you see these planes, and then nowadays, uh, a lot of people know specific planes, like Memphis Belle, for example. Everybody knows the Memphis Belle, and you got all these different names of planes and whatnot. But then you watch Masters of the Air, and these guys, their plane got destroyed, so they went and jumped in another B-17. So for you, how often were you finding yourself in a different plane, or did you get to stay in the same plane longer? I mean, because according to the show, and that's what everybody's used to seeing now, because that's such a new and fresh show, you guys were getting beat up and banged up so bad. I don't know how any of the planes took off more than once. Um, you know, so how
Well,
often were you having to shift
sometimes,
things around?
yeah, sometimes we could luck up and they would attack another part of the formation or another formation entirely, and we'd come back virtually unscathed, but scarcely without any damage at all.
Right.
We almost always suffered from either anti-aircraft fire and or the rockets, the cannons, and the machine guns of the fighters.
Okay.
They had lots of ammunition and lots of ways of attacking us. Uh, and initially, they developed the technique of head-on attacks. They would fly around our formation and get out in front 3 or 4 miles and line up in line abreast, 30 or 40 of them in line abreast, and would fly directly through the formation, fishtailing as they did and spraying us with all of their ordnance. And we didn't realize it, but uh, believe you me, when you look out of the corner of your eye while you're trying to desperately to stay in position in your formation and see their wings lighting up like Christmas trees as they fired their rockets and cannons and machine guns, there was only a 4 second interval during that confrontation, that rate of closure, which was at altitude almost 500 miles per hour. There was only a 4 second interval where their guns would actually bear on us and our guns would bear on them. Seemed like 4 years, but it was really a very brief span of time. But because our guns would not come down beyond just absolute level, and our top turret gunner could come to level, the ball turret gunner could come up to level, and that left this little slot or window, and that's what they got in was that uh, magic position, and they'd fly right straight through us
Wow.
and take down numerous planes either by colliding with them or shooting them down. And then they would split us out and turn around and go out and do it again. And this was an extremely effective way of defending their targets. You have to remember that they'd been flying for 4 years.
Right.
And they'd been battling against the Russians on the Eastern Front and the British on the Western Front. And they certainly had honed their techniques as to how they defended their motherland or fatherland, whichever you want to call it. And their backs were to the wall. They were fighting for their homeland. And heck, we were 6,000 miles away.
Right.
And oddly enough, when we arrived in England, we flew our own airplanes over. And you ask if we flew the same airplane. Well, we did, as long as it was serviceable or as long as we could.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as that ceased to be the case, then we'd get another airplane. We actually flew our planes from the U.S. all the way across the North Atlantic to Scotland, and then down to our particular base. Mine was at Thorpe Abbotts, where the Hundredth was located. And so that's how we entered the conflict. And those were some of the conditions under which we had to survive, if we
Wow.
could.
Well, and you did. So, give us, I know you've done a lot of these interviews over the many, many years you've been alive. I know that we've got an awesome book that I'm looking forward to reading. But give us a couple of interesting things that perhaps nobody's ever asked you. You know, you said you wish that the Masters of the Air series had portrayed what happened to you and your group that had never been done before. Is there any particular story that you find interesting or that you would like to share that perhaps nobody's ever asked, that's maybe a little bit different than what most people would be interested in hearing from you? I want to hear something that interests you that perhaps nobody else has ever cared about.
Brendan, when we were suddenly thrust in the right-hand seat as co-pilots, that had a profound effect on the morale of the crews that had already gone through training together and suddenly had the number 2 man replaced. Some of the crews accepted us because those were orders. That was the way the military functioned, and that's what we were destined to do. Others resented it terribly. They thought, well, good night. Here's this new shaved-tail lieutenant that doesn't know from nothing. And I'm going to have to rely on him if anything happens to the pilot. And that was the reality of it. That was not really portrayed or dwelt on in any way, or even referred to in any significant way in the docuseries. But it was the reality of what took place. Now, on the crew that I was assigned to, the navigator and the bombardier, there were 4 commissioned officers, the 2 pilots, pilot and navigator, and the navigator, pilot and co-pilot, and the navigator and the bombardier in the front of the airplane. And the navigator and the bombardier on my crew had been madly fond of their previous co-pilot. They buddied with him, they partied with him, they drank with him and chased girls with him, and he was really a close buddy. The pilot was not. The pilot was an introvert, and he kept to himself very much, and he did not really condone or condemn the behavior of the navigator and the bombardier toward me. They did everything in their power to make my life hell and try to force me to throw in the towel and ask for a transfer. Heaven knows what they might have gotten in my place, but nevertheless, that wasn't their measure. They just wanted to take revenge on the system that caused them to lose their buddy from his very important position on the crew. And so when we started to fly our airplanes, they issued us new equipment, new planes that had been retrofitted with extra fuel tanks so we could make the long journey over the North Atlantic from Newfoundland all the way to Scotland, which was a 12-hour flight. And that was only if we had a favorable tailwind. So when we got to Newfoundland, we had to sit there and wait on the elements, the wind currents, to favor us in order to take off. So while we were waiting, this pilot that I was assigned to whom I had to look for all of the training that I got, as meager as it was, about the equipment and about the crew, took it upon himself one night to go across the base, and he shacked up with a British WAF and ended up in the hospital with a raging case of VD. So the rest of the group, when winds were favorable, took off and went on to Scotland, while our particular crew, had to sit there and sweat out the treatment. Pardon me. The only treatment that they had in those days was sulfur. And so he was bedridden for 2 weeks and overdosed with sulfur. And when he was finally released, he was so weak he couldn't stand up. So we had to literally load him into the cockpit. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, Lucky, I guess you're going to have to fly because I can't." And I said, "Well, that's pretty darned obvious, isn't it?" So I called the navigator and the bombardier aside and I said, "Now look, you fellas have really made my life miserable. You've done everything in your power to get me to leave the crew, and I'm not going to leave it. You've now got to depend on me to get us to combat." And I told the navigator, I said, "Now, if you do not hit the landmark landscape on the nose when we get to Scotland, I'm going to personally throw your butt out of the airplane without a parachute." So that tended to level the playing field to some extent. But that's how we went to war. And sure enough, we did manage to make it all the way to Scotland nonstop. And even though we were behind the group when we got to the base, we had to catch up immediately, and the pilot was embarrassed about his actions, and so he volunteered us for every mission. He said, "We're going to fly the fastest tour in the European theater, and I'm going to go home." And so we flew and flew and flew. And on about the seventh mission, um, for some reason, we weren't scheduled to fly, but someone else was scheduled to fly our airplane, the one we'd flown overseas, which he named Sunny, Sunny, for his son.
Okay.
And uh, they got shot down. So that plane was gone.
Mm.
So we got another plane and we called that Sunny 2. And I flew 21 missions with that crew. But we had a standing operating procedure that when your crew was designated as the lead crew of the entire formation for the group, then the co-pilot was replaced by a command pilot who was in charge of the entire formation. And the co-pilot then was sent back to fly the tail gun position. This is another thing that the series did not reflect. But they put me in the tail on the first mission that we led, and I had never fired a 50 caliber in my life. I didn't have any idea what I was supposed to do. I was freezing to death. It was just bitterly cold. You were totally isolated out in the tail of the airplane, all by yourself, and the only contact you had was on the intercom with the pilot. So the strategy was supposedly that by putting a pilot in the lead plane of the formation, that he would be the fire control officer to control the fire for incoming attacks from the rear. But what was completely ignored was the fact that the tail gunner couldn't communicate with anybody but the pilot, and the pilot then had to switch channels and radio out to the rest of the formation what the danger was or the circumstances were. And by then they were completely changed. Things happened so fast, so rapidly, that you didn't have that luxury of uh, instant communication and reflection of what we should do or how we should do it. So when we got back, I said, I burned out both barrels. I just bore down on the triggers and didn't know any better, but the heat from the constant firing melted both barrels. And so I sat there for the entire mission like a knot on a log. And all I could do was call out planes going down or planes coming in on attack and hope for the best. But when I landed, I said, you didn't train me to be a gunner. You trained me to fly this airplane. And I'm not going to get in the tail again. You can court martial me. You can do whatever you have to do, but I'm not going to get in the tail again. So as a consequence, I sat on the ground while the crew led successive missions, and they finished up their tour in September of middle of September of 1943 in 89 days. Fastest tour anybody did.
Wow.
And they were rotated back to the States. But I still had 4 missions to go. And so I was elevated from a pilot to the squadron operations position. And I was in charge of uh, setting the formation for a particular squadron, telling who was going to fly and when and where and what position and that sort of thing, in addition to checking out the replacement crews that came in to take the place of our losses. And that was a ground duty in addition to still having 4 missions to complete my tour. So it took me as long to fly those remaining 4 missions as it had the first 21 because of my ground duties and other responsibilities. And so that really uh, focused my attention and my abilities, whatever they were, on doing a much different job than just being an airplane commander.
All right. Now, your last 4 missions, did you fly those with the same crew, or
Oh no,
how did you end
no,
up? Not the
flew
same
them.
crew you started with. Your remaining 4 missions, was it?
No, I did not. I flew with as a command pilot.
Okay.
I would fly with different. Every mission was with a different
Okay.
crew.
Okay. I see. So when did you fly your last mission?
February 13th, 1944.
Okay. And I guess right after that, you were headed back home?
Not immediately.
Okay.
I suddenly was out of a job. Having finished my missions, I didn't have any more responsibility.
Okay.
And so, from being so focused and intent on doing what I was doing and trying to do it to the best of my ability, I suddenly was completely at loose ends because I didn't have any responsibility at all. And they left me on the base for about 30 days. And then they said, well, you can either accept the job as a squadron commander, or we can send you to the Pathfinders and you can fly mosquito bombers uh, to point out the targets, or you can go home and be an instructor for crews that are coming over. And I said, well, how soon can you cut my orders to go home? Because having survived a tour of 25 missions with the Bloody Hundredth Bomb Group, I didn't want to press my luck any further. And so finally, after a couple of months, they shipped me home by boat. And that took 12 days on an old um, wreck of a boat that was a relic of the First World War called the USS George Washington.
Okay.
And so I came back with very few returnees because virtually nobody was finishing a tour and being rotated back to the States. They were either shot down or didn't survive, and consequently, there were very few of us on that boat. But we played cards and played poker and tried to entertain ourselves for 12 days, flying across the treacherous North Atlantic. And the German Wolfpack's submarines were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of war material that were coming over. So it was uh, pretty treacherous to have to undertake that kind of a journey, but we didn't have any choice.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine flying 25 missions. You make it through that, and then you've got to go across the water and watch out for submarines.
Right.
So
And then when I got home, of course, they sent me on another 30-day leave to go home. And from there, I went down to Miami Beach to a redistribution center. And um, uh, they still didn't give me any, I wasn't flying, I wasn't doing anything, I didn't have any responsibility. And I was actually suffering, I know now, I didn't know it at the time, from PTSD. They didn't recognize it in those days, but they ended up sending me to a rehabilitation hospital over in St. Petersburg, Florida, which I had to stay for 6 weeks. And I didn't have anything to do. I just had to report for roll call every morning at 8 o'clock, and the rest of the time I was free to loll on the beach or visit the local bar.
okay. All right. So you're back in the States now. It's 1944. You have no responsibilities. What did you do from there? A year and a half later, the war's over. How did the end of the war for you end up? How did everything go? And then how did you transition back into uh, getting a job? Where did you move? Did you move back to Chattanooga? Tell us a little bit about after you were done and after the war was over, how you got back to
All
your
right.
life here in the States.
After I got out of this rehab hospital, they sent me to the only instrument pilot school that they had in America at Bryan, Texas. And I said, for God's sake, I needed that before I went overseas, not after. to learn how to fly instruments. But I discovered that uh, there was a fraternity brother who was an instructor from my hometown there, and he'd been there all during the war, and so had all the other instructors. None of them had ever been overseas. And of course, the war was still going on. This was 1944. And so, but that's where I met my future wife of 71 years. So it was the luckiest thing that really happened to me during the entire wartime experience was meeting her and uh, pursuing her hand in marriage eventually. Uh, in 1947, I did get married in 1946, and in 1947, the Air Force became a separate branch, and they offered a regular commission to certain of the reserve officers then on duty, and I was one, and we had to pass an exam, but I was accepted as a regular officer, so I had decided that I didn't know anything else. I didn't have a college degree, and so I might as well make the military my career. And so by then, they had transitioned me to B-29s and given me a crew and said, well, you're now going to the Pacific and fight another war. So, unfortunately, or fortunately for me, the atomic bomb was dropped when it was, and I didn't have to go. But uh, the new Air Force, as it was known then, United States Army Air Force, it was the fifth uh, branch of the military, uh, offered a program whereby these newly integrated officers could go to any college in America under full pay and allowances, including flying pay, and complete their education. And so I said, well, that suits my needs completely. So I applied, and my credits were accepted at Stanford University in California. And I was ready to go back to college, but I never got any orders. So I flew down to Maxwell Field, where the Air University was then, and they were administering the program, and said, well, you have this marvelous program. I applied and was accepted and never got any orders. How come? And they said, well, how old are you? And I said, well, I'm 26 now. And they said, well, we have an age limit in that program of 32. And I said, yeah, so what? And they said, well, the problem is that we have so many in the pipeline ahead of you. If they don't get in, they lose out. And I said, yeah, I understand that, but how long am I going to have to wait just to get in the pipeline? And they said, well, according to our calculations, just before your 32nd birthday. And I said, wait a minute. I have been out of college now for 6 years fighting the war. And you want me to wait another 6 years before I go back and hit the books? And they said, well, we're very sorry, but that's the way the system is structured, and that's the way we have to conduct it. So I flew back home. I was then stationed in Fort Worth, Texas, at the 8th Air Force headquarters. And I told my bride that I could go back to college then uh, as a civilian under the GI Bill. So I decided that I would resign my regular commission, which I did, and got out of the service. And instead of going back to college in California, I was accepted in at the University of Denver in Colorado, and we moved to Denver. And so I did complete my uh, education and got my bachelor's degree in pre-law and business at DU and in 1950. And then, of course, while I was going back to school, I was also holding down a couple of jobs, and among them was in the real estate business and commercial real estate. And so ended up forming a, a group to develop air-conditioned mall shopping centers, and built the first one west of the Mississippi River in Denver, and opened it in 1956.
Wow.
And so from there, I migrated to Dallas and did another one, and and then decided that Dallas was a better location to headquarter in than Denver. So I moved to Dallas in 1960, and had a career in commercial real estate development.
Wow. And that's where you are now in Dallas?
That's where I am now.
Okay. That's awesome. So, Chattanooga to Europe to Dallas.
Yes.
Well, that is excellent. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with us, Lucky?
Well, I didn't talk about my wartime experiences for 50 years.
Okay.
I was like a good many veterans, um, reluctant to talk about them. They weren't pleasant memories. They were, of course, we were terribly young when we were uh, fighting the war. We were asked to defend our freedoms and our country, which we did. Um, but there were not memories that I really wanted to recall. I wanted to make that a closed book and just go on from there and look to the future instead of the past. And then in 1999, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a luncheon for a symposium that was conducted at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, that was conducted by the chancellor, who was a former professor of military science at the Air Force Academy. And he invited me as a veteran to recount my experiences at this luncheon. He held this weekend symposium annually, and I said, well, I haven't done that before, but I'll give it a try. So I did. I recounted my experiences, and at the end of it, he said, well, did you write that speech? And I said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I did, because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say or how I wanted to say it. And he said, well, I would love to include it in a book that I'm publishing on some of the lectures that have been made at my symposiums. He'd been making these symposiums for over 20 years. And with your permission, I'd like to include yours. And I said, okay. So I gave it to him, and he published what he called Warriors and Scholars. And uh, my speech happened to be the first one uh, that he recounted or repeated. And from that, numerous civic groups and church groups and retirement facilities and professors of all grades, including college, uh, requested that I speak with their groups. And so I began uh, developing a PowerPoint presentation and got on the lecture circuit where I've been for over 25, 30 years now. And at one point, I told my dear wife, I said, I'm sick to death of hearing my story. I've heard it so many times and repeated it, and I'm through. I'm tired, and I'm going to hang it up. And she said, "No, you can't. That you literally have an obligation and a duty to remind younger and successive generations of the horrendous sacrifices that were made, or they wouldn't be here. And so you've got to continue as long as you can. So that's why I do continue."
Wow, that's awesome. Well, I certainly appreciate you coming on here and spending some time with me and telling us some things. And like I said, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Uh, and I hope that you're able to continue doing interviews like this for yet another very long time.
Well, thank you, Brandon. It's been nice being with you, and I hope to hear how you like the book.
Absolutely. I'll make sure to send you an email as soon as I get done and let you know what I thought about it.
Do. I'd love to hear your opinion.
All right,
Well,
Lucky.
thank you so much for including me, and I wish you the very best, and God bless America.
Thank you, Lucky. Thank you very much.